Would you dare move into a house where someone claims to be watching your every move, even before you walk through the door? What if, before you go to bed, an anonymous letter shows up warning you that your children are being watched by someone who never shows their face? In 2014, a happy family bought their dream home on a quiet New Jersey street. But instead of a welcome, they received a threat, an invisible and obsessive presence. Letters began to arrive, then fear, then terror. And to this day, no one has discovered who is the watcher. This is a true story, based on facts that have never been explained, and what you are about to see may change the way you look at your own home. It all started in June 2014, when Graham and Lillian Hawthorne, a polite, private and successful couple, purchased a charming 3-story colonial home at 657 Boulevard Street in Westfield, New Jersey. With 3 young children and a life on the rise, the Hawthornes believed they were about to realize a dream. The house cost $1.3 million and seemed perfect. Classic facade, large backyard, quiet streets and discreet neighbors. It was the ideal place to build family memories. But what seemed like a new beginning turned out to be the beginning of a nightmare. A few days after the purchase, while they were still overseeing minor renovations before the final move, Graham went to the mailbox and found an envelope with no return address, typed letters. The letter shocked him. The writer identified himself as the watcher and said he had been in charge of watching over the house for decades as part of a family tradition. The tone was polite but deeply unsettling. He said he had been watching the arrival of the new bloodline with interest and mentioned the couple's 3 children, describing their ages, habits, and appearance in terrifying detail. At first, Graham tried to remain calm, believing it was a cruel joke or a bizarre attempt at intimidation by some jealous neighbor. But Lillian reacted with maternal instinct and visceral fear. The words in the letter did not seem to be the result of a delusion. There was method and precision to them. She began to distrust everyone around her. Every open window or half-open blind felt like a vantage point, and the house, once cozy, began to feel like a stage for something bigger, something invisible. Within a week, more letters arrived. This time the tone was more direct. The sender asked why the family had not yet moved in and said he was looking forward to watching the children explore the dark basement. In another line, he suggested that the secrets of the house were alive in the walls. The watcher's obsession wasn't just with the property, it was with the residents, their movements, their vulnerabilities. Frightened, the Hawthornes realized they were facing a threat they couldn't see and might never understand. The second letter arrived a few days later, and with it, the tone changed radically. The watcher was no longer limited to strange greetings. He now referred to Graham and Lillian's children as fresh young blood, and asked if they had discovered what the rooms hide at night. With each envelope, a new layer of fear was added. The sender seemed to know when the builders were working, which rooms were being repaired, which windows had been opened. The surveillance seemed constant, and worse, real. Lillian began to refuse to visit the house alone. Graham, although more restrained, could no longer sleep well. The couple installed security cameras, reinforced locks, and changed the routine of visits to the property. Still, the feeling of vulnerability persisted, and fear began to creep into the children as well. They noticed that their middle daughter was having constant nightmares and refused to go to the basement, even though she had never been there. Something invisible had taken root in that house, the terror of being watched without knowing by whom. The seemingly quiet neighborhood began to look like a hotbed of potential suspects. The Hawthornes made a mental map of every house in the neighborhood. An elderly neighbor who rarely left the house? A young man who always rode his bike and stared at the property? An old woman who watered her plants at the same time every day? Everything seemed out of place. Graham even filed an informal complaint with the local police. The officers interviewed the couple and took the letters as evidence, but none of them seemed enough to start a formal investigation. After all, they were just letters. Even with the growing alert, authorities were hesitant to act. The content of the messages was strange, yes, but there was no explicit threat, no obvious crime. With no evidence of trespassing or physical damage, the Hawthornes found themselves trapped by institutional neglect. Meanwhile, the letters kept coming. At night, at dawn, no clear pattern. Someone was watching them. I knew where they were. And even more disturbing, he knew what they were feeling. It was as if the house was alive and telling its secrets to a stranger outside. With no concrete answers from the police, the Hawthornes decided to investigate on their own. Graham delved into public records about the house, looking for any previous mention of the name The Watcher. He discovered that the property had been in the same family for nearly a century, and that the last resident before them had died shortly after selling it. There was no evidence of foul play, but the history was strange. Each family that lived there only stayed for a short time, and they all sold the house in a hurry. Something always seemed to drive the residents away, something that no one dared to name. Lillian, in turn, began to observe every gesture of her neighbors. She created a diary with routines, schedules, who looked too much and who never looked. A resident on the right side, Mr. Baldwin, was the main focus of her suspicions. He lived alone, rarely, received visitors, and showed an uncomfortable curiosity about the construction work on the house. One morning, Lillian caught him standing on the sidewalk in front of the house, staring at the roof for long minutes, motionless, as if in a trance. When she opened the window, he simply turned and went into the house without saying a word. Other names began to surface. A teenager who lived 2 doors down and loved to write horror stories. A new mailman who always smiled too much. A local real estate agent who had once lived on the boulevard and seemed uncomfortable talking about the house. With each new suspicion, more insecurity. The Hawthornes no longer trusted anyone. The neighborhood, which had seemed like an outdoor paradise, had become a maze of stairs. What was paranoia and what was intuition? The line between real fear and delusion grew ever more blurred. In one of the most disturbing letters, the Watcher asked, "Who among you sleeps in the room facing the street? I'll find out soon." The message was the trigger. The family stopped construction altogether. The children were banned from the property, and Graham hired a private investigator who set up hidden cameras around the house, combed through handwriting records, and even analyzed family trees of former residents of the area. But nothing, no DNA, no solid leads, just the suffocating certainty that someone out there knew everything about them and was still watching. What started as discomfort and distrust evolved into constant fear and deep exhaustion. Graham and Lillian, who had previously made excited plans about the rooms and the future of their children in their new home, began to avoid even saying the address out loud. The children, who were not fully aware of what was happening, began to show signs of anxiety and regression. One of the children started wetting the bed again. Another developed a fear of windows, and the youngest asked daily if anyone was going to come into the house at night. Fearing retribution, the Hawthornes kept quiet about their parents, friends, or co-workers. Lillian began to suffer silent panic attacks, and Graham, increasingly absorbed in his investigation, began to miss work. The family avoided contact with their neighbors. They lived among boxes, waiting for a change that never came. The beautiful house on Boulevard Street had become a monument to despair. a symbol of something too dark to understand and too silent to prove. The financial stress also became unbearable. The couple had invested all their savings in buying and renovating the property. Afraid of involving their children, they refused to move, but they also couldn't sell it. Any potential buyer would back out when they heard the reports. When they finally decided to file a lawsuit against the previous owners, claiming that they knew about the danger and didn't warn them, the story went viral, and with it, the story of the Watcher reached the media. What had been a quiet nightmare became a public spectacle. When the case came to light, an avalanche of curiosity and theories took over social media. Some thought it was all a hoax devised by Hawthorne himself, perhaps to nullify the purchase. Others believed in cults, organized surveillance, or ancient rituals tied to the land. The house became a haunt for teenagers, mystery hunters, and vandals. The family's privacy was destroyed. And Watcher, silent as ever, never sent letters again. As if he were observing, with satisfaction, the collapse of what was once an ordinary family, as if he had won. Even after years of investigation, private surveillance, and media coverage, no one has ever been formally charged or identified as the person responsible for the letters. The case was closed by local authorities for lack of conclusive evidence. And that, for the Hawthornes, was perhaps the cruelest blow, the lack of justice. Graham described in an interview that the most disturbing thing was not the content of the letters, but what came afterward, the emptiness, the not knowing. How can you go on with your life knowing that someone knows everything about you and could write to you again at any moment? Lillian developed generalized anxiety disorder and for a long time refused to be alone, even in her own home. Her children grew up with a distorted understanding of safety and privacy. For them, the idea of home no longer equated with protection. The house on Boulevard Street sat empty for years, its windows boarded up and a silence that seemed to weigh down the bricks. It was eventually sold for well below market value and under specific contractual clauses that prohibited mention of the affair. The public obsession also left its scars. Many said that the Hawthornes had made it all up. Blogs and forums fed this theory for years, pointing out contradictions in the testimonies, in the sale prices, in the dates of the letters. But what these people could not explain was the simplest. Why would an entire family abandon their dream home and subject themselves to years of humiliation and trauma if it was all just a fabrication? This question lingers to this day, unanswered, amidst assumptions, skepticism, and fear of the unknown. When asked if they would ever feel safe again, Graham simply replied, "It's not about safety, it's about control. The Watcher took that away from us, and we never got it back." The pain of uncertainty became the new normal. The nights were silent again. Yes, but not peaceful. Because somewhere someone knew exactly what happened. And they didn't have to get up from their chair to cause terror. They just had to write, observe, and disappear like a shadow that can never be explained and never be erased. The house is still standing. The windows were replaced, the garden replanted, the facade painted a different color. Anyone who passes by today might see just another beautiful residence in one of New Jersey's most traditional neighborhoods. But those who know the story never see the same thing, because there, in that issue, at some point between 2014 and 2017, someone wrote letters capable of destroying a family, without ever showing their face, without leaving a trace, without committing a single technical crime. And yet, it caused enough fear to empty an entire home. The Hawthorne case remains one of the most enigmatic examples of unsolved psychological horror. No videos, no witnesses, no fingerprints, just words. Words that invaded, that destabilized. and they continue to echo even years later as a cruel reminder that danger does not always lie in shouting or in actions, but in silence and in waiting. The real horror may lie in someone who just watches. And that's what makes the watcher so scary. He didn't have to do anything else, because fear did everything for him. Even after so much time, the mystery remains open. Who was the observer? A disturbed neighbor? A former resident who never accepted losing? His house? A conspiracy of several people? Or someone who simply found pleasure in controlling the panic of others? To this day, no new letters have appeared, but no certainty either. And the emptiness of this absence is perhaps the greatest blow. Because when the enemy is invisible, the fight never really ends. It just adapts, camouflages itself. And sometimes it moves to another house. Now, the question remains, if it were you, would you be able to sleep soundly knowing that there is someone out there who knows exactly who you are, where you live, and what your kids are doing in the basement? Comment below. What would you do in the Hawthorne family's place? Subscribe to the channel, activate the bell, and leave your like if this story gave you goosebumps, because real terror rarely has a face, but it never stops staring.